Okay, we're back from our break. I understand that our people in the Woodlands had a little trouble connecting with us, so I wanted to check in with the people in the Woodlands. Can you hear me? Can you answer?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I can actually see you on the monitor here. Did you miss the hi? Did you did you miss the discussion of the first paper? Was that a problem for you? Okay, I'm going to go over that again very quickly for you. So if you have any questions, now is the time to ask them in the Woodlands or North Houston or West Houston or Fort Bend. If we can look here, the first paper is due on the day of the fourth class meeting, and for the studio classes and the remote site students, that will be next week, right? Your paper is due next week. For the KUHT students, it's a week from the time you see this broadcast. Here is my mailing address to mail it to, and please spell Houston correctly when you when you address it. Include a stamped self-addressed return envelope. Now, those of you at the remote sites, you can email them to me if you would like. And here is my email address right down here. And attach your paper as a Word document. Those of you in KUHT students, you should do that as well. Okay, so either email it or mail it to me, or you can drop it by the history office if you wish on the day that it's due. Okay, now, this paper wants you to ask questions. It should be 5 pages, double-spaced, 10 to 12 point types with normal margins. So don't squish it all up into 3-inch margins, and don't make it with 1/4-inch margins. It won't come through on my printer. Okay, so normal margins and normal type. You should survey and assess and think about your present knowledge of the High Middle Ages and the concept of the 12th century Renaissance. Now, a lot of what we've seen already in this first 3 weeks, we've seen a lot of things about the fall of the Roman Empire and about the early Middle Ages. Most of this is background. We haven't gotten to the High Middle Ages yet, really. The first night I lectured on the overview of the High Middle Ages and the medieval Renaissance, and Pat Orr, our next lecturer, will get into the High Middle Ages. She'll be talking more about it. But we really haven't, she talks a lot about the early Middle Ages as introductory material, so we really haven't gotten into the meat of the 12th century Renaissance. This is all preliminary materials. So include in your paper the 3 introductory classes, weeks 1, 2, and 3, and read the introduction that I wrote in the handout book, and read Colin Morris, The Discovery of the Individual, and Jean Gimpel, The Medieval Machine. Those are the 2 books you should have read in order to write this paper. Now, what do you not know? And this paper asks you to write about things you don't know anything about. In other words, what are the holes in your knowledge? What are the gaps in your knowledge? What don't you know? For example, maybe you don't know yet about how Charlemagne's Renaissance contributed to the 12th century Renaissance. Maybe you want to know how Charlemagne was regarded by the 12th century. Maybe you would want to know how the Vikings were assimilated eventually and disappeared because they were completely assimilated. You don't know that yet because you haven't had a lecture on it. One student asked me a question about whether you could ask questions about things we're going to learn about, like courtly love and chivalry and King Arthur. Yes, you can ask questions, because if you don't know anything about them, that's what you're supposed to do, ask questions about that. What do you need to know to understand the medieval Renaissance? Okay, and in essence, I've lost my little sticker here, but one thing about it is that this is an essay. Don't give me a list of questions, but write an essay with an introduction and a discussion of the various questions you have, and you'll probably have more than one. You can have as few as 5 questions and as many as 20 or 30. I mean, it depends on how you look at it and how you organize your material. And then end with a conclusion that explains what you've done and how you've approached it. So it's a real essay. Okay, any questions either in class or off campus? Is that pretty clear to you in the Woodlands? You've got it now?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, good. All right, now, good. I'm glad we went over that again. I want to show you very quickly a couple of maps that will help to review a little bit John McNamara's lecture. Again, to refresh your memory, here is Europe at the time when the Germanic people had swept through all of Europe, and here they are impinging on Britain. You can see Britain up here to the north of Europe. Here are the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes, which John McNamara mentioned as going to England. Here are the Jutes going to England, the Angles going up this way, and the Saxons going in this direction. And here are the settlements that they made in England. Here is Northumberland. He mentioned, he called it Northumbria. It's the same area, Northumberland and Northumbria, the area north of the Humber River. Here is East Anglia, where the Angles settled, Essex, where the East Saxons settled, Kent, Sussex, where the South Saxons settled, Wessex, where the West Saxons settled, and Mercia. I don't know where that name came from. But this is the invasion by the Angles and the Saxons of Roman Britain. And here, as he mentioned also, is the map of Canute's empire. And the yellow on this map is the area dominated by the Vikings, and you can see the areas, I've cut part of it off, but the Vikings are in all of this area here. And the green is amazingly Canute's empire. And you can see that he has all of England and Norway and Denmark and parts of Sweden. And so he was really forming a North Sea empire with the heart of it here in the North Sea. And so before the Normans conquered England, there was a potential for a Scandinavian world centered around the North Sea. And the Normans changed all that. We'll get into more of that. But I wanted to orient you to the maps as John McNamara talked about England. And here is England at the time of the Norman conquest. And these aren't exactly the kingdoms that were settled by the Angles and the Saxons, but the kingdoms, the areas of England that were developed later, they became earldoms. The kingdoms, in essence, became earldoms. And at the time the Normans conquered, they were ruled by Scandinavian Danish earls left over from Canute's empire, and Earl Godwin and Harold Godwinson were in fact Danish earls. And these are the major earldoms that the Godwins controlled. Here's Northumbria and Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex. And so that's how England, that's England on the eve of the conquest. Okay, I just wanted to sort of visually and spatially attune you to that kingdom. Okay, now we're going to turn to our second lecture. Now we've seen early medieval France and early medieval England, and one of the things you might want to do is make a timeline and put the notes side by side for the dates of England and France that you saw from Michael Moore's lecture and you saw from John McNamara's lecture, and see what was happening in France and in England at the same time. We're up to the brink of the medieval Renaissance, on the threshold of rebirth or regeneration, and we're going to add just one more element to the mixture as we're looking at the early Middle Ages, the role of women. And again, we must return to Rome and the early Christian era for models that pervade the Middle Ages. But high medieval people did not always agree, as we shall now see. And one of the points that Pat Orr makes is that people argued about the status of women. And that's one characteristic of the medieval Renaissance. Suddenly, new questions were being asked, and asked in a new way, and people were arguing about them. One of our major concerns in the medieval Renaissance is the lives of men and women. And we've seen the explosion of technological and economic growth. The increase in the standard of living meant more leisure time, more luxury, more refinement, and less work for mere subsistence. How did men and women respond? And how did society adapt their roles? How did men and women see their own places in this enriched world of the High Middle Ages or the medieval Renaissance? Now we're going to see Dr. Patricia Orr, who was formerly, at the time she gave this lecture, in the Department of History at the University of Houston, and she's going to talk to us about medieval women.
In order that you may know just a little bit more about me, I am a legal scholar, and because my interest in the law led me to an interest in what was happening to women in the law, I started a study of medieval women, and so I arrived before you this evening. It's certainly true that as we get to the High Middle Ages, as they used to call it, the flowering of the Middle Ages, as Sally so aptly calls it, there is more time, more leisure, more ability to think about what were the relative roles of men and women, what was their value in society, and to the Almighty. If you look at the continuum of thinking about women's roles, there is a lot of thinking with the Greeks and Romans, with the Old Testament authors, and with New Testament authors, right up through the patristic authors, until you come to the time of greater impoverishment after what we like to call the fall of the Roman Empire, whether it actually fell or not. And then things are very quiet for a long time, because there is more energy expended on simply living, on simply surviving, or welding together a large state, as Charlemagne did, and much less to consider relative roles. But of course, with greater prosperity, with more food, with people living longer, with leisure to be educated, to think, then all sorts of questions arose. And certainly questions about women did. Now, I'm going to present to you a lot of information, I hope, in the time that we have, about women. Some of it is going to seem very strangely dogmatic. Even, you could almost use the word oppressive. It's important to remember that the scholars who are making the distinctions were considering that there were a great many problems on their minds that having to do with heaven and hell and salvation and damnation. And women and their roles were somewhat secondary. So we are going to hear what scholars came up with when they weren't concerned with something that they thought was a little more important. I'd like to start, oh yes, put my name on there, by all means, by talking just a little bit of how we look at medieval women today. We're looking back, and looking back over several centuries. And I'm going to tell you about just a very few scholars. We don't have time for much. But I think it's much more important that I find out what you think. So I'm going to ask you to do a little exercise just as we start. And I want you to choose a word that for you expresses what you know or think about medieval women, their life or their status, their opportunities. One word. I'd like you to write that word down in your notes, just as a favor to me. And if you would, I'd like you also to pass around a piece of paper. If somebody would just get out a piece of paper and write their word and pass it to the next person, so that I can have a record of what you said. Okay, I think. All right. Thanks. I appreciate that. Now, you off campus, I will be expecting to hear your words too. And perhaps you can send the words in to me by whatever courier service you all use. Well, now that everybody's kind of going, could I hear a few of the words? Does somebody want to offer one? Yes?
I use the word sacred.
Sacred. I have never had anyone use that one. And this is really kind of a first. What made you think of that word?
With the interest in religion in the Middle Ages, I figured many people would see women as copies of Mary.
And that was a very important and a somewhat later development. And it was one that was to rescue women from a lot of thinking that denigrated and belittled women. So that was an important concept. Anybody else? You, okay. Poxed.
Poxed with like scars and ugly and dirty and like that.
You must be watching the same movies I watch. Yeah, it was a very difficult time, and women probably had the most difficult part of it. Then that when there was a lot of illness, and especially when nutrition was lower, then women would suffer the most because they were the ones that bore children and had to give a lot of nourishment to their children. And certainly we have beautiful, beautiful illustrations of women that probably glossed over a lot of the details. Anyone else? Yes?
Secondary.
Oh, secondary. Thank you. Where are you from?
North Campus.
North Campus. Okay. Secondary. So who's primary?
Men, or maybe even God.
Okay. Well, actually, when you figure God into the hierarchy, you get women as tertiary. So, because it would be a hierarchy of God, men, and women. And certainly the medieval people saw it that way.
Limited came to my mind.
Limited in what way?
Limited access to the system, which was run by men, the legal system, the economic system.
If you want to think of limitations, or I think I almost would prefer the word restrictions, because limitations has a kind of a personal context. I have limitations. I don't always spell well. But that's not my society's fault. But restrictions, certainly. There was a strong feeling that a woman should not rule on her own, for example. Very strong feeling. When you get into the law, there was a pattern of life set out for women in which women were to be always treated as a minor citizen. Now, you'll hear a lot about women being chattels or women being property. And although I think you can make a case for the appearance of that, in legal terms, a woman was always a ward. She was always under the guardianship of someone, her father, and then her husband. That was the legal point of view. Whether women actually went along with that point of view is another matter. And probably usually they did. But the restrictions, the limitations society placed on women were very broad. Anybody else?
Subhuman, because of the idea that they came from Adam's rib and weren't fully human, weren't made in the image of God.
Well, maybe, yeah, maybe even human, but not quite as good a human. Deformed or defective in some way. Yes, that's a very strong current in medieval thought and in the writing that we're going to examine, and you evidently are familiar with this. That there are some philosophical reasons for this, and also some typological reasons, looking at Eve and her creation, looking at her. Thank you very much. Is everybody on this? Okay. And so, yes, second class, subhuman, flawed in some way. We might could take one more. Yes.
I said subdued.
Subdued.
Basically, I thought that they weren't able to like an open role in any part of society. Basically, if they had to do it, they had to do it through influencing men, or leaders that were men, or some other role in the government.
And so, in their own world and in their own sphere, regardless of what the philosophers were saying or the theologians, in the life as they lived it, they had very little latitude, and they could, and they were under the control of somebody else, somebody maybe near and maybe very dear to them, subdued. So, some of these distinctions that you all are making are very, very good. And I was tempted just for a minute to go off and say, all right, you just about got it. But I think we probably need to go into these things a little more. History, of course, is based absolutely on the sources we can find. And one of the first disadvantages we run into when we're studying women is that the sources are relatively scanty, relatively scarce. A lot of the sources that have survived have to do with men and men's activities, and women's have to be inferred or gleaned by very careful and patient reading. So we start at a very slight disadvantage in that way, or rather a large one, really. In another, I guess a disadvantage to studying women is that it hasn't been done for very long. It used to be that history was a matter of politics, battles, constitutional development, and then, of course, economic history made its appearance. History of women really made its appearance only in the present century. Of course, as it comes to its end, that's a fairly long time, but not enough to develop a large body of work. I'm going to mention just a few historians picked absolutely arbitrarily. You would go and pick other ones, although everyone might pick Eileen Power. She was the first person really to think very seriously about a history for women. And she studied women's activities, and it appeared to Eileen Power that women in towns had a great deal more latitude than women seemed to have from the studies that had been done previously, because they were helping their husbands with their crafts and with their merchant activities, and because they took a very large part in the work, and sometimes, especially when a husband died, they would take over the shop themselves. So for Eileen Power made this terrific breakthrough, finding some kind of absolute sphere for women. Now, Doris Mary Stenton, I put in, she was a legal historian, and I am a legal historian, and she and her husband, Frank Stenton, looked at the effects of feudalism on women, and working mainly from the theory of feudalism. Although Ms. Stenton knew the sources that I study very, very well, they argued that women suffered greatly from the arrival of feudalism, that was an all-male system and a military system, and that women ceased to have any particular sphere of activity, that their powers and influence went down dramatically. Another legal historian, and has written almost nothing about women, but his attitude typifies many attitudes that you hear generally. He saw women in the law as conduits for inheritance. That was their main function. That land would pass from, say, a man to his grandson through the daughter, mother, who was the middle generation, that kind of thing. Now, at this moment, women's history is experiencing an enormous, almost an explosion. There are a great many more people studying, writing, asking new questions, thinking in new ways about women's studies, much less restrictive ways. And I say in specific context because that seems to be the most fruitful area, to take a specific woman and look at her life, how she interacted with the people around her. Or to take, for example, Florentine young women of marriageable age and see how their dowries go. Pick a context and see how their dowry, I should say. Pick a context and see how women work within it. I put in Jean Truax because she is a recent PhD graduate of this university and has published several things and is working very well. She looks quite frequently at the major figures in medieval history and how they interacted with women. Pope Gregory the Great, who followed the usual line about women theoretically, depended very heavily on women as correspondents, of whom he would occasionally ask advice. Now, these views, of course, depend heavily on and look back to views that medieval people held themselves. And I'm going to suggest only two to start with, two highly contrasting views. Woman as demon and woman as saint. There are a lot of different ways to look at society's attitudes. In our length of time, I prefer to simplify. I have here the misogynistic tradition. And there was a long, millennia-long tradition of writing about women, of trying to examine women's nature and how they could interact with men. That is quite clearly at least anti-feminist and is generally called misogynistic, against women. Demon picture. The Middle Ages elaborated a great deal of thinking about demons and about the forces of evil in the earth, and they certainly attached some part of that thinking to women themselves. But the tradition did not start in the Middle Ages. It was borrowed, it was inherited, and it goes all the way back. As farthest that I care to trace it is to the classical era, the writers of the Greek and Roman civilizations. Aristotle, in his writings on natural history, argued that women were, in fact, biologically inferior to males. They had no real equality at all. Women were defective. In their development, parts that should go outward had turned inward. There was not enough heat and dryness in a woman's physical body to produce the necessary parts. So a woman was defective. There was he also thought that in the generation process, a woman contributed the matter, the body of the new human being. It was the male who produced the semen that gave the child its soul. I was almost about to say mind, but it's soul that he argued. He also, of course, this carried over into an intellectual argument that women could not be educated, that there were two classes of people that could not be educated, slaves and women. Occasionally you would find an exceptional slave and be able to educate him, but a woman you never could. Ovid, Roman writer, took his own tack and wrote about women as if they were flirts, money grubbers, gold diggers, you might say, noisy, unfaithful, entirely bewitching, and finally rejecting. There's no use to be connected with one, and yet it was hard to stop trying for Ovid. Of course, we have to remember that he was a satirist and holding up Roman society, but women do not come off with a very good portrait in Ovid. Juvenal, perhaps even worse, about if you do win a woman, she will tell all your secrets and spend all your money and not give you any time to study or think. Of course, there are other views. Plato has an absolutely charming passage in the dialogue, the Symposium, in which Socrates is taken to task and comes off second best in a dialogue, and it's the only place that I have seen in which Socrates comes off second best, to a woman named Diotima, who lectures him extensively on the nature of love. And you can think of other things, perhaps, such as Sophocles and his Antigone, who represents the mores and the better values of the race. Another root point of the misogynistic tradition was the Judeo-Christian tradition. Now, the Old Testament, of course, provides us with the typology of Eve. Eve as the first fallen person, the person who first succumbs to temptation and then drags Adam down with her, if you want to look at it in this way, and certainly the Middle Ages finally did. In the wisdom literature and elsewhere, there are references to women as being in some way a trap for men, whether sexually, as in Delilah, who entrapped Samson and then betrayed him, or as in, again, the disturber of the household, who with her noisy children and her demands for new dresses will not let a man earn his living or study or even sleep. In the New Testament, the emphasis certainly was a little different. They took up the Eve story as part of their view of women. Certainly St. Paul did. But there was a new idea of celibacy as being the highest form of life. Celibacy teaching was directed at both men and women. But in the preachings and in the teachings as the new religion developed, most of it was directed at men, and most of it was what you might call a modern-day avoidance therapy, describing women as being extremely unattractive and harmful so as to make the life of celibacy seem like less of a sacrifice. There is also some teaching of subordination of women, in that women were not capable of teaching in church, according to St. Paul, of speaking in church, and should actually learn from their husbands at home. Now, there were some counter-influences in the teachings. there are multiple examples of women who were strong, effective women. Deborah, the judge. Judith, who killed the advancing general Holofernes. The women who followed Jesus and listened to him. The women who were the only ones present when Jesus was crucified. The patristic writers, the great writers of the early Christian faith, certainly absorbed a certain amount of what they had heard. And I'm going to skip very quickly over this because it is possible to take too much time. Tertullian was an early Christian writer, 2nd century, as I recall, whose point about women was that they were vain, that they overdressed, and he argued that if a man desired a woman, it might very well be because she was dressed that way, and it would be her fault. And when they came to judgment, and he was judged for having desired her, it would really be her fault, and she would go into judgment with that against her. John Chrysostom had a very extreme view of the silence of women. They were never even to speak in church. And he excoriated them for their dress as well. Jerome wrote the most extreme of the polemics against women. A poor man named Jovinian had said that virginity and marriage were pretty much equal, that virginity wasn't that much better, celibacy was not that much better than marriage. And Jerome put him in his place. And in doing so, he called on all aspects that he could think of both traditions. He was very well schooled in the classical tradition and had learned the Old Testament tradition. So his accusations against women were very strident. And he was considered to be extreme by most of the scholars of his age, particularly by Augustine, who had a much less pointed view of the inferiority of women. Augustine subscribed to the idea that biologically a woman was inferior. But he saw her general nature and her soul as being equal. That she needed guidance. He subscribed to her weakness of will. That somehow she was more a subject of the passions and less a creature of reason than men, and needed the guidance. But that her spirit and the value of her spirituality were the same. It's interesting that as I looked into each of these men, they all had very strong relationships with their mothers. And here we have Augustine, seated as Bishop of Hippo in North Africa, and also the author of countless treatises, some of which touched on women. Now, there were mitigating factors, as I have here. For one thing, even Jerome said women did have a chance in this world. Women could, if they observed celibacy, if they studied diligently, and if they followed the direction of men, they could become almost male. And in that way, they would redeem themselves. And some of the aspects of thinking itself, of philosophy itself, lend to a kind of ambivalence about these attitudes towards women. This is the lady philosophy. The verbs for intellectual activity were very often, the nouns were very often feminine ones. And so knowledge and philosophy and wisdom would be represented as females. Now, late, this is Boethius, as he writes his great consolation of philosophy, being advised by the lady philosophy, as he then passes on what he has said to the people around him. But there were some results, and the general opinion of women when this was that women were swayed by their emotions. They were far more erotic than men, far more passionate, and it was their passion that brought men, particularly men trying to be celibate, into disaster. And thinking resolved itself into a series of hierarchies. The Middle Ages was a great time for hierarchies, for arranging things in their relative worth. And in the hierarchies, we find, of course, as we said before, God above humans. Christ as being above and in charge of the church. Mind as being superior to and the director of the body. The reason as being superior to and directive of the emotions. And you see where all of these hierarchies are leading. Man, the mind, the reasoning creature, very much superior to woman, the emotional, erotic creature who is representative of the body. Man, mind, woman, body. And the husband as superior to his wife. Jesus had said that men must love their wives as Christ loved his church. It became a hierarchy that in a marriage, the husband was to the wife as Christ was to the church. And so, of course, a wise woman would be obedient and understand the necessity of guidance. The central theology of the new Christian church, however, provided again some counter tendencies. One is that women played an enhanced role in the Christian church itself. If you read the book of Acts, then you will find many households headed by women who convert their whole households. You find women following Christ and being taught by him and learning from him. And as I have mentioned before, women's souls are equal. It is of as much urgency to convert a woman as it is to convert a man. This picture, it is a fairly ambivalent one. This is by Fra Angelico, a sermon being delivered by an apostle. And perhaps you can see that all the people on their knees and being very, very silent, no doubt, are women, all in a group. And the men stand, and evidently, I think one or two of them may be speaking. But you'll notice that the people that are directly in front of the apostle are the women, and they are listening closely. Okay, let's go to the next one. When the rewards are given to the righteous, when the crowns are handed out, the women are there as well as the men. Okay, we'll go on. Thank you. The other typology I want to look at was the woman as saint. And here we see a very extraordinary phenomenon in that women were very highly revered from the very earliest Christian days, and as people began to think in terms of a saint, a person whose behavior and faith were such that he or she could be memorialized for a life thus spent, women became very, very prominent. And this lovely picture is from one of our own manuscripts here in University of Houston. You can, there are 11 wonderful pieces of medieval manuscript work up there. This is a St. Agnes who was killed evidently in around the year 304 AD because she, at the age of 12, although she's represented as being quite a bit older here, refused a marriage to a pagan. Now, in order to understand what people's attitudes towards female saints were and what they got out of their lives, I think we need to examine a primary source. So I have put in here for your use a much reduced version of a primary source, an Anglo-Saxon poem called Juliana about the Saint Juliana, also martyred, and I have turned it into a play. So for this, I am going to need some help. I warn you that if you don't volunteer, I'll have to do it. And you don't want that. You want to be Africanus? All right, thanks. All right, narrator, would you start this for us?
Listen, heroes have told how, in the time of great persecutions, a powerful nobleman named Aloysius was obsessed with desire for a saintly maiden named Juliana. He was set on marrying her, but she was determined to remain a virgin and to dedicate her life to Christ. In spite of her wishes, Aloysius got the promise of her father, a noble named Africanus, of her hand in marriage.
Juliana, I have your father's permission and I intend to marry you.
Fear not, if you are a follower of the true God, I shall be at your will. But if you worship devils or idols, idolize false gods, the most agonizing tortures will not force me to marry.
Africanus, how can you allow your daughter to insult me like this?
It's you.
Do as you like with her, kill her, or let her live. It is up to you. Aside to Juliana, dear, dear daughter, this powerful man could be very good for our family. Do not let him get away from you if you can possibly help it.
If he worships false gods, he must find love from someone else.
You are trying to be the master here, but I will show you. I am a merciful man and will let you live, but you must suffer the most dreadful of tortures.
I trust in Christ, the true king, not in the earthly ruler like yourself.
Juliana was hung by her hair and violently beaten. Then she was dumped in a prison cell where she could reconsider her position. There a devil came to visit her, hoping to bend her will.
I trust in Christ. Who are you?
Trust me, I am an angel from God, here to tell you to relax, marry Aloysius, and miss the tortures he has designed for you.
God, my true protector, tell me who this creature really is.
Grab him and hold on to him with all your might, and maybe he will tell you what you want to know.
Let me go. I'm not used to this kind of treatment. It was easy to tempt Judas and Herod, and I had no trouble inciting Nero to martyr Peter and Paul. Satan, who sent me here, expects good performance and will deal harshly with me if I fail here. Ouch! Let me go. I'll go on and tell you that I also have deceived the true God's followers with false visions and sour and angry thinking. It was no trouble to win many souls. Sometimes, though, a particularly valiant and shrewd soldier of the true Lord, bearing holy shield and armor, courageous in prayer, can stand against me. I implore you, have mercy on me. When I set out on this mission, I never expected such a bad time as this.
The devil had fared better with Aloysius, who commanded that Juliana be brought into his court. She came, dragging the helpless devil with her.
Oh, Juliana, please do not humiliate me in front of everyone here, the way you did in the prison cell. I can't do anything to change you. Let me go.
Juliana did so, but soon the devil came skulking back, hoping to save himself from punishment by secretly telling Aloysius what to say. shining maiden, if you do not obey me, I will send you to a painful death by fire.
Oh, yeah, so it is. Sorry. Yeah, go on.
Shining maiden, if you do not obey me, I will send you to a painful death by fire.
Juliana was bound to the stake, but a multitude of angels came to her rescue, and one put out the fire. Even a cauldron of seething, bubbling, molten lead failed to subdue Juliana, although its heat killed 75 of the heathen.
She cannot defy me. Cut her head off with a sword. That will put an end to all this.
Oh, holy joy. I know that soon all my troubles will be over.
This is the end for me. She will be dying without yielding. I will be humiliated again, and there will be no end to my punishments.
The devil scuttled away to his just deserts, and Juliana was carried to the country's border to be executed. There she began to advise and preach to the people.
People, give praise to Almighty God. Live in sincerity of His love. Be guided by the light of faith, and God will grant you grace as at need. Pray for mercy on my soul, and peace be with you forever.
A blow from the sword sent her soul into everlasting joy. The cowardly Eleusis took himself and his soldiers off on a sea voyage. All met their death in a storm and were carried off to Satan in torment. The crowd, with songs of praise for God, carried Juliana's body into the city, where God is still praised and revered. O reader, I need the help of both the saint and you. When my soul leaves its wedlock with the body, let the saint aid me, and let each of you pray to God for me, that I and all of us may find God merciful in our final hour.
I don't like this ending.
Marvelous job. Next time you'll win. What points would medieval people have picked up from this source about the behavior of saints and about women in general? What was a virtue here? Yes.
They'll be rewarded in heaven, even if they suffer in this world.
Yes, and so she goes through all these terrible, terrible torments. And as you said it so well, oh, holy joy is her reaction to death. Yes?
The role of the woman as that person keeping maintenance of morality, the way that the father said he could go ahead and beat her or whatever, and she said she wouldn't take him if he took false idols and such.
Who was supposed to be her authority?
Her father.
Her father, absolutely. So what's happening to fatherly authority here?
It's being shown as how it can be like wrong, or misguided.
All right, we've got a really misguided father here. So does this mean that loyalty and obedience to a father has gone by the board here?
Not necessarily.
Okay, what happened?
Because the Heavenly Father, it's a father figure, is also, she's being obedient to that particular father.
She has simply moved her obedience up to a higher level. And an earthly father cannot command her to do something that is against the Heavenly Father's will. Or if he does, she does not do it, and that is not a disobedience. What does this do to fatherly authority?
It undermines it.
There is a certain undermining force there. That there are, as you put it, there are things that, or was it you? There are things that, there are moralities, there are beliefs that are above even the obedience to the Father. Anything else? Yes.
This story be kind of referring to, I'm not really sure about this, but weren't a lot of the early saints martyrs, and basically they kind of suffered under certain similar circumstances for basically to show how their faith was the most important thing above all, above like being tortured or going against whatever authority or figure at that time, but you had to be strong in your faith with God.
Absolutely. This is exemplary, and it's exemplary of faith and of great courage in faith. And so who is the courageous hero? Well, he's always the most interesting character. Yeah, we do have a woman here functioning as a hero. She is a hero above the status of a nobleman and of her father. Anything else she does that's kind of interesting? Yes?
She accepts her suffering without complaining about it or whining.
Yes, she does. Now, this is the weaker person. Why can a weaker person sit in a cauldron of lead, be hanged up by her hair, and that kind of thing?
She preaches to the people. She teaches them.
That's the most startling departure in the whole thing. She preaches. Of course, she's on the edge of town. But she is preaching and instructing. What gives her the power to do that?
Her faith.
Okay. Yes, she is a person of faith. And that moves her out of all the typologies and into a stronger position than the men and the women to whom she is preaching. Her strength is direct from the Almighty. Now, you can go on with this for a long, long time, but I see I have left myself with very little time, and we have 300 years to get through. So I've got this nice flower. So we're approaching, that Diane gave me, since we're approaching the flowering in the Middle Ages. And these ideas that we've just seen thoroughly trounced in the play Juliana moved straight into the Middle Ages because of the process by which the Middle Ages transmitted knowledge and did their writing. The most important thing to include in a medieval piece of writing was the authorities that you used to give your writing weight. That was called auctoritas, and you bolstered your writing with as many authorities as you could, quoting them. The activity by which you found your authorities is called inventio, and that's not inventing things or making things up. That's finding them. It's from invenire, the Latin word for finding. So the authors continued this tradition using their authorities, Jerome, Augustine, and finally Aristotle, and developing in their own way. There were certain societal developments going on at the same time that probably did change women's status. One, a secular one, was the rise of feudalism. And as a military system, it must have had some effect, although I'm going to argue not nearly as much as Lady Stinton perceived. In the church, there was an upheaval of reform called the investiture contest about who was to give to a bishop or other official his insignia of ecclesiastical office. Do you want me to say that again, or do you want to just know it? Part of this reform was a strong emphasis on the priest as the authority who would keep the reforms in place, who would keep people aware of what they should be doing. And of course, the priest was always male. And a very strong affirmation of celibacy for priests, which brought about a pitch of thinking about celibacy equal to what was going on in the patristic era. The misogynistic tradition continued, partly borrowed from the ancient writers and the patristic writers. Abelard subscribed to some of its teachings, although he made the very interesting point that since women were weaker, they were privileged as being, in some way, the truer recipients of God's grace. And he also said that men would be judged at judgment much more harshly because they were the stronger characters and should not sin as women did. Thomas Aquinas sort of combined Aristotle's thinking and Augustine's thinking in that he perceived women as being actually, in their physical nature, incomplete, defective. He didn't go quite so far as Aristotle and say deformed. But like Augustine, he saw that their soul was as good and as effective a carrier for them to heaven as a man's. And he was one of those that is supposed to have said, and actually, yes, actually he did, one among many, that a woman was created from Adam's rib, not from his head to rule him, not from his feet to be under him, but from his side to be beside him. One woman has said he doesn't warm a feminist heart, but we find the message mitigated. The satirists used all of that they could find in Juvenal and Ovid and other sources to write send-ups of marriage, of parodies of marriage, to discourage young people from entering into it. And even in the popular culture, in the Romance of the Rose, there are very long passages in which these same perceptions are retailed over and over again. Now, this is a kind of introduction to what I'm going to say next, and we will cover each of these points in turn. But certainly there were counter developments that seem to bring about a more favorable view of women. One was the love of disputation that drove medieval thinking. And so an author might list a long list of terrible things about women, and then he would go on and give every argument that he could think of that was in favor of women. So you could quote him on either side. It became kind of an intellectual game, of sword play, I have it, because they would joust with each other. The Marian cult arose, in which Mary was seen as a redeemer of woman's nature by her obedience to the call of God. She redeemed Eve's disobedience. And the topos is called Eva Ave. You turn it around from Eve, who fell, to Hail Mary, for a redeemed nature. And the humility of a woman, a young woman, bearing a baby, is an example of the weak person who triumphs over the strong, as we've seen in Juliana, whose obedience, again, whose weakness allows God's grace to show through in medieval thinking. Some of the aspects, and we're just going to have to be a little patient about this, the motherly aspect, the loving aspect is one thing that the Marian cult brought into. As people began to see themselves more and more as individuals, as your book about the development of the individual says, they saw themselves as worthy of love, and Mary represents love. Let's have another one. But you see also the topos of Mary receiving kings, holding Jesus, that a kind of attractiveness that and finally we see Mary herself as an individual, reading a book, an educated woman, surrounded by people involved in various occupations. A different view, an individualistic view of a woman represented in Mary. Of course, this comes out of the courtly love tradition, and I might as well go on to that very quickly. You're going to get a great deal about courtly love later on, and I will just mention it's possible. It sees a woman as a prize. This is ambivalent. She may either be something to be fought over, and we have a castle with full of ladies being assailed by gentlemen who want the ladies for some reason or other. And but also there's a sense in which the woman was to be obeyed in courtly love. We have Lancelot and Guinevere here, and Lancelot on his knees, Guinevere seated. he is to obey her directives. It gives her perhaps a higher status. One of my students one time said it puts her on a pedestal, and nobody can do much on a pedestal. But now, the demands of real life brought out an awful lot of women's own character, their own abilities. And I think I would like to go on and look at the lives of actual women and see how that worked. Well, let's just go through this real quick. You could actually write a job description, and I'll try to get this. If you want to take notes, just don't. I'll get some kind of list. And okay. But you see, they're starting with educating children. There are a great many. Okay, thanks. And then oversee all employees. Employees is a kind of a modern term, but it's sort of what women had to do. Everything from educating the children, brewing the ale, to seeing that everything went right. And there's more. Sometimes it was necessary to manage all of the properties, to give advice from the practical knowledge that women gained. Sometimes women carried out governmental duties of various kinds, and we'll see how that goes. Defend castles? Well, what if the husband was gone on crusade or off battling? Who was going to take care of the defense if someone attacked? It was going to be Matilda or Alice. Lead armies? Occasionally, in support of their husbands. A nun? And this is a cross-section by ecclesiastical affiliation or not. Very, very similar. Fundraising, very important. Convents tended to be rather poor sometimes. And everything from looking after the children in the local area to, under their care, to, again, advising males with the highest. And every once in a while, defy the archbishop. Oh, run through this very quickly. Now, all these skills, if they look a little bit like those of a top executive, well, there's a reason for that. And, of course, determination to put all these things into practice. Now, I'm going to talk about one queen, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who first helped her husband. She had two husbands. She evidently engineered her own divorce from the first one, married Henry II of England, bore him several sons, interfered in his government. Well, let me say that she was his regent, she was his help, until she actually stirred his sons up to rebellion. He didn't care for that and sent her to Salisbury, in a beautiful place, but a long way from London. She outlived him, came back to be regent for two of her sons, and set up a marriage that was to change the fate of France. Let's just skip these because the time is running out. There were several other queens. Let's just go to the question that I wish I could detain us for, some that actually did lead armies and defend castles. The question that is posed, one is, why were all these women so effective? Was it simply because they were queens? And it's amazing how many of the queens, over and over and over again, every example was a highly effective leader and a highly effective queen with governmental duties. Was this just because she was a queen and had the latitude? Well, I have looked and found a great many noble women. Every time I find a noble woman, I find her doing some of the similar things. And I wish I could go into the examples. I will ask you to trust me on this. But if you will read a book, a fairly scholarly book called A Small Sound of the Trumpet, I think that you will be amazed. So I need to run through those. Common women. And we have these, I can't even stop for Hildegard. Read Hildegard. Whatever you do, go and read about her. Mystics who use this idea of a direct connection with God to inform and dictate to men. I want you to read the cases in this book. These make, that I have put in here. Alice Clement, put in a nunnery, escaped, got married, carried out everything she wanted to do in the law, even though she was against formidable opponents, and it took her over 20 years. The question I pose at the end is, was it worth it? Milsom said it wasn't. I want you to answer that. Alicia, daughter of Richard, was accused of tearing out a guy's eyes. You're laughing. Wounding him. Well, that was supposed to be the punishment for rape. It was never imposed. We can only wonder what Alicia's motive was. Lucia de Moristot said somebody had stolen stuff from her. They listened to her, they kind of laughed and gave her 3 pennies to get her cloak back. The kicker to this is that it was illegal for her to bring an accusation of robbery. She was never supposed to do it. But almost every time that women did it in the court rolls, they were successful. One guy got hanged for stealing 3 pigs out of a forest. When a woman's complained of being robbed, the judges came down on him hard, usually. I just put that last case in there because it's a following of evidence, and it is the only such case in the rolls that I have found in which they follow the horse, they find out about the horseshoe, they get witnesses, and connect all the events together. The person who was offended against was a woman. The person who was evidently the ringleader was a woman. In this one and only case. Goodness, we're racing through this. Yes. And Marjorie Kemp, the woman who was a commoner, 14 children, and became a mystic, a very noisy one. I hope you get to read about her sometime. And Joan of Arc, the world's most famous peasant woman. Women had some outlet besides the family. They did work. They were domestic servants. They had occupations that they followed. Nurses in hospitals. They did have, I think, more mobility than we see. I think I see this in the legal cases. I also think I see women staying single longer than we think. I've got a lot of work before I can argue that. But I see that now, and I'm going to keep working on it. Let me see. We'll just have a nice look at Joan there. I want you to look back at your word that you had. You may want to change it. You may not. But I hope you have had a chance to look at what we have done and see whether women were, how subdued were they? Pretty subdued? Yes. But not entirely.
Okay, we have just a few minutes left for questions. Did anybody have any questions or comments? Yes.
I have one question. Alicia Clement, she actually did get her land back. Is that?
Yes. This is Alice Clement is the last case here that she has in the readings book, and she fought her case through the court.
In the book, it actually never says that she got it.
She got it back. She got it back. Yeah. And this is the kind of evidence that Pat was working with to trace the status of women and looking at the law courts, and it's very hard to dig it out, but that's the kind of evidence that people work with to do women's history. Any other questions or comments? I was kind of surprised that Pat didn't mention a very famous book that's called Jesus as Mother, and one of the really surprising things that a scholar, I'm forgetting her name right now, but she discovered that in some of the prayers of the monks, they prayed to Jesus as a mother and compared him to a mother. And so they actually gave him a female persona, the personality of a woman, so which is kind of interesting. Well, in the minute or two we have left, I thought I'd show you some of the pictures of women. There was a question that was asked to me earlier, where are these pictures coming from that I'm showing you? They're actual drawings or photographs or paintings of real medieval manuscripts. Here is a female saint of the Roman era. This is what Juliana might have looked like, a Christian woman in the early period. Here we've seen this picture before, and Michael Moore suggested that these might be the daughters of Charlemagne. This is what they might have looked like as Carolingian women, as people of high status. And here are women of the 6th to the 10th century who also would have been, this is how they would have dressed at the time of Charlemagne and from the 6th to the 10th century. Here is a nun, Hildegard of Bingen, might have looked like this, a nun in the 11th century. And here are actual chambermaids of the 13th century, nurses who care for babies. And here are some women also of the 13th century, some very elegant, noble women. Here are some more noble women with their children. And here are women attending to childbirth. And finally, the Virgin Mary, the model for all women in the High Middle Ages. So with that, we turn to the second half, or the second portion of the class next week, and don't forget to turn in your papers.